The unforgiving Montana winter of 1899 showed no mercy to anyone, least of all to Sarah Mitchell and her 5-year-old twin daughters, Hannah and Eliza. Huddled in an abandoned trapper's cabin miles from the nearest town, their bodies weakened and their spirits nearly broken, they prepared to face what seemed like a grim, inevitable fate. Cast out by her late husband's wealthy family, with nothing but a small satchel of belongings and the clothes on their backs, Sarah had exhausted every option to protect her children. As the relentless blizzard threatened to become their executioner, an unexpected savior emerged from the howling storm. James Running Wolf, a mixed-blood Blackfoot scout who walked between two worlds, neither fully accepted by white society nor completely at home with his mother's people. Their chance encounter would challenge everything they believed about family, loyalty and belonging, forging a bond that defied the rigid social boundaries of their time. This is the forgotten story of how 4 unlikely souls found hope when all seemed lost in the harsh wilderness of the American frontier. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special. For you, Sarah Mitchell's trembling hands struggled to maintain their grip on the small tin cup of melted snow she offered to Hannah, whose pale face had taken on a bluish tinge that terrified her mother more than she dared admit. Beside them, Eliza lay bundled in every scrap of fabric Sarah could spare, her normally energetic personality subdued by hunger and cold. "Just a few sips, sweetheart," Sarah encouraged, pressing the cup to Hannah's cracked lips. "We need to keep our strength up." The abandoned trapper's cabin they'd discovered 3 days ago had been a godsend after nearly freezing to death in the forest. But it offered little protection against Montana's harshest winter in decades. Gaps between the rough-hewn logs allowed bitter wind to slice through, and the small fireplace could barely keep one corner of the one-room shelter above freezing. Outside, the January blizzard howled with unrelenting fury, piling snow against the cabin's single window until only a faint grayish light penetrated the gloom. Sarah had no idea how much time had passed since they'd been forced from Thornfield Manor, the sprawling Mitchell family estate where they'd lived since the twins were born. 6 weeks ago, her world had made sense, despite the tension with her in-laws. Sarah had a comfortable home for her daughters and the protection of the Mitchell family name. Then William had died, suddenly, tragically, thrown from his horse during a hunting expedition. Her husband of 6 years was gone, and with him any pretense of tolerance from his family. "He only married you because he got you with child," Victoria Mitchell had declared coldly at the funeral, her voice carrying just far enough for the nearby mourners to hear. "Now that my son is gone, there's no reason for you or your bastard half-breeds to remain under our roof." The words had cut deeper than any knife, not just for their cruelty, but for confirming what Sarah had long suspected, that despite William's genuine love for her and their daughters, his family had never accepted his marriage to a schoolteacher, whose father had been a simple blacksmith. Within a week, Frederick Mitchell, William's father and patriarch of one of Montana's wealthiest cattle dynasties, had made it abundantly clear that Sarah and the twins were no longer welcome. No inheritance would come their way. William's will had been mysteriously misplaced, and Montana Territory's laws favored the father's family in such disputes. "Take this and be gone by morning," Frederick had said, tossing a small pouch of coins at her feet. "If you're wise, you'll head back east where you belong." But Sarah had nowhere to go back east. Her parents were dead. Her small hometown in Pennsylvania held nothing for her. So she'd taken the twins and the meager payment to Helena, hoping to find work as a teacher or seamstress. The money had lasted barely 2 weeks before Sarah faced the brutal reality that no one would hire a widow with 2 small children in the middle of winter, especially one whose dismissal from the powerful Mitchell family sparked whispers throughout the territory. With their last coins spent on a stale loaf of bread and passage on a logging wagon headed north, Sarah had pinned her hopes on reaching the mining town of Sweetwater Creek, where her cousin's husband reportedly worked. But the blizzard had forced the wagon to stop miles short, and the driver, unwilling to risk his horses, had left them at a crossroads with vague directions and empty promises of sending help. That had been 3 days ago. 3 days of trudging, through deepening snow until, by divine providence or sheer luck, they'd stumbled upon this abandoned cabin. Now, as Hannah's cough worsened and Eliza's quiet whimpers grew fainter, Sarah faced the horrifying prospect that she had failed in a mother's most fundamental duty, keeping her children alive. "Mama," Eliza whispered, her small hand reaching out from her nest of ragged blankets, "are we going to see Papa soon?" The innocent question delivered a physical pain to Sarah's chest. Her daughters, despite their young age, understood death. They had stood beside their father's grave, watched as his casket was lowered into the frozen ground. Now they were connecting their current suffering with that memory. "No, my brave girl," Sarah managed, fighting back tears as she smoothed Eliza's dark hair from her forehead. "We're just resting until the storm passes, then we'll continue our journey to Sweetwater Creek." It was a lie born of desperation. The truth was that Sarah had no idea if they would survive another day, let alone reach a town that might be another 30 miles away. Their food, the stale bread and handful of dried apples, had been exhausted yesterday. The firewood she'd scavenged was nearly gone, and the storm showed no signs of abating. As darkness fell, Sarah made a decision born of maternal instinct and primal fear. Taking the last pieces of wood, she built up the fire as much as possible, then gathered both girls into her arms, wrapping their shared blankets tightly around all three of them. If this was to be their last night on earth, they would face it together, wrapped in whatever warmth and comfort she could provide. "Tell us a story, Mama," Hannah requested, her voice thin but determined. "About the warrior princess who saved her people." It was their favorite tale, one Sarah had invented during happier times, featuring a brave young woman who overcame impossible odds through cleverness and courage. The irony wasn't lost on Sarah. Here she was, facing impossible odds, with neither cleverness nor obvious courage to save them. "Once in a land of towering mountains and endless skies," she began, her voice steady despite her fear, "there lived a warrior princess named—" A sudden noise from outside interrupted her storytelling, a distinct sound that stood out from the storm's constant howl. Sarah froze, straining to hear. There it was again, the crunch of footsteps in deep snow. Approaching the cabin door, her first thought was bears, desperate enough to seek shelter despite human scent. Her second, more terrifying thought was of the Mitchell family. Had Frederick sent men to ensure she and the girls had truly left Mitchell territory? With trembling legs, Sarah rose and placed herself between her daughters and the door, grabbing the only weapon at hand, a rusted poker from beside the fireplace. Whatever was coming, her children would have to go through her first. The footsteps stopped directly outside. Then came 3 solid knocks that rattled the cabin's thin wooden door. "Hello, the cabin," called a deep voice, calm but authoritative. "I mean no harm. I've tracked your smoke for the last mile and brought supplies." Sarah hesitated, poker still raised. In normal times, she would never consider opening a door to a stranger in the wilderness. But these were not normal times. And if there was even a chance, this person truly offered help. "Mama," Hannah whispered, "is someone coming to save us?" The hope in her daughter's voice made the decision for her. Lowering the poker slightly but keeping it ready, Sarah approached the door. "Who are you?" she called, trying to sound stronger than she felt. "James Running Wolf," came the reply. "Scout for the 7th Cavalry, currently on leave." I have food, medicine, and dry firewood. Your children need help." The simple, direct assessment of their situation, spoken without judgment or pity, struck Sarah with its truth. Pride had no place when her daughters' lives hung in the balance. Slowly, she lifted the crude wooden latch and pulled open the door, revealing a tall figure wrapped in furs, his broad shoulders dusted with snow, his face partially shadowed by a wide-brimmed hat. In his arms, he carried a bundle of firewood, and a heavy pack was slung across his back. As he stepped into the cabin's dim light, Sarah saw a man of perhaps 35, with features that spoke of mixed heritage, high cheekbones and copper, skin that hinted at native blood, but eyes a startling shade of grey that must have come from white ancestry. A long scar ran from his left temple to his jaw, disappearing into a short beard flecked with ice crystals. "You and your children are in danger of freezing," he stated matter-of-factly, moving past her to deposit the wood near the dying fire. "This storm won't break for another day at least." His calm efficiency, as he immediately set about building up the fire, struck Sarah as both reassuring and slightly unnerving. This man moved with the quiet confidence of someone intimately familiar with survival in harsh conditions. "Why are you helping us?" Sarah asked, still gripping the poker, though less tightly now. James Running Wolf paused in his work and regarded her steadily. "Out here, we help those in need or we all perish. Questions come later." It wasn't quite an answer, but as warmth began spreading from the revitalized fire and the scout unpacked what appeared to be dried meat, hard biscuits, and a small pot for melting snow, Sarah found herself too grateful to press further. Behind her, Hannah's weak voice rose with unexpected energy. "Are you a real Indian?" Sarah turned, mortified at her daughter's bluntness, but found James Running Wolf's expression had softened slightly. "I am Apsea Look and Irish," he replied simply. "Blackfoot through my mother, but I walk in both worlds." He handed Sarah a piece of pemmican. "For the children first, small pieces, slowly, then tea when I've melted more snow." As she took the offering, their fingers brushed briefly, and Sarah was struck by the warmth of his hand, despite the bitter cold outside. In that moment, she realized just how close they had come to death, and how completely their fate now rested in the hands of this stranger who had appeared like an answer to desperate prayers she hadn't even voiced. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The night passed in a fragile balance between desperate hope and lingering fear. James Running Wolf worked methodically, his movements economical yet thorough as he transformed their dire situation. With minimal words, he reinforced the cabin's gaps with snow and cloth, created a more efficient heat reflector for the fireplace using the cabin's only metal pan, and prepared a thin but nourishing broth that brought color back to the twins' pale cheeks. Sarah watched him carefully, maternal vigilance never fully yielding to trust. Yet with each passing hour, as Hannah's breathing eased and Eliza's eyes regained their spark, her suspicion gradually gave way to cautious gratitude. "The worst of the storm will pass by tomorrow afternoon," James observed, looking up from where he knelt beside the twins' makeshift bed. He had given them a few drops of a bitter herbal tincture from a small bottle in his pack, explaining curtly that it would help prevent lung fever. "But the trails to Sweetwater Creek won't be passable for at least 4 days." Sarah's heart sank. "How did you know we were headed to Sweetwater?" A ghost of a smile touched his scarred face. "You talk in your sleep. You dozed for about an hour." Heat rushed to Sarah's cheeks, both at the realization that she had fallen asleep in a stranger's presence and at his casual revelation that he had watched over her slumber. "We can't impose on your kindness for 4 more days, she managed, though the protest sounded hollow even to her own ears. They had no alternative. James regarded her steadily. "Mrs. Mitchell, how do you know my name?" Sarah interrupted, alarm. Returning swiftly, he nodded toward the twins. "The dark-haired one, Eliza, she called you Mrs. Mitchell when asking for water." His grey eyes held hers without wavering. "Names aren't secrets out here, just facts, like the fact that you and these children won't survive alone until the trail's clear." The blunt assessment hung between them in the cabin's close air. Sarah felt a complex emotion rise within her, not anger at his presumption, but a strange relief at hearing their predicament stated so plainly. For weeks she had carried the full weight of their survival, pretending for the girls' sake that she had a plan, that she could protect them through will alone. "What do you suggest, Mr. Running Wolf?" she finally asked, surprising herself with the steadiness of her voice. "My cabin is a half-day's journey from here," he replied. "Better built, better stocked, with proper medicine and food. We rest today, leave at first light tomorrow when the storm's eye passes." "And then?" Sarah pressed, needing to understand the full scope of what he proposed. James stood and moved to the window, scraping frost from the small pane to peer out into the swirling white darkness. "Then you heal, gather strength, and when the pass is clear, I guide you to Sweetwater Creek." He turned back to her, his expression unreadable. "Or elsewhere, if your plans have changed." There was something in his tone, not judgment, but a quiet acknowledgement of the uncertainty of her situation. Sarah wondered suddenly how much of her story he had pieced together. A woman and 2 children, clearly unprepared for winter travel, headed toward a mining town with only the most meager possessions. It didn't take a skilled tracker to recognize desperation. "Why would you do this for strangers?" The question escaped. Before she could contain it, for a long moment he said nothing, and Sarah thought he might not answer. Then he reached into his shirt and withdrew something that hung from a leather cord around his neck, a tarnished silver locket. "My mother was Blackfoot, taken in by a white trader who recognized her intelligence and eventually married her, despite the prejudice they faced," he said, his voice softer than before. "When I was 10, she fell ill while my father was away trading. No white doctor would treat an Indian woman. No white neighbor would help the squaw and her half-breed son." He tucked the locket away, his expression hardening again. "We help or we don't. There's no middle ground in this wilderness." The simple philosophy struck Sarah with unexpected force. How different from the calculated social maneuvers of the Mitchell family, where every kindness came with expectation of return, where worth was measured in bloodlines and bank accounts. "We accept your help," she said quietly, "and are deeply grateful for it." He acknowledged her words with a slight nod, then returned to practical matters. "The children need more rest. You too. I'll keep watch and prepare for tomorrow's journey." The next day dawned with an eerie stillness that James explained marked the storm's eye, their narrow window of opportunity to travel before the blizzard's second wave struck. He fashioned a sled from materials in and around the cabin, wrapping the twins in every available blanket and securing them to the makeshift conveyance. "It's not elegant," he commented, testing the bindings one final time, "but it will keep them off the snow and conserve their strength." Sarah, wearing an extra layer of clothing James had provided from his pack, marveled at the ingenious construction. "You've done this before, many times." He didn't elaborate further, simply handing her a walking stick he'd carved the previous evening. "Stay directly behind me, step where I step when possible." The journey through the snow-transformed landscape was both beautiful and terrifying. Familiar features had vanished beneath 6-foot drifts, and what had once been forest trails were now unrecognizable corridors between towering white walls. Without James's confident navigation, Sarah knew they would have been hopelessly lost within minutes. Despite the physical demands of their trek, Sarah found herself studying their guide with increasing curiosity. James moved through the snow with efficient grace, pulling the sled containing the twins while simultaneously picking out the safest route. Occasionally he would stop and point out something to the girls, a fox's tracks, an ice formation that sparkled like diamonds, a distant eagle riding the currents above the storm clouds. These small moments of wonder seemed to energize Hannah and Eliza, who despite their weakened condition responded with delighted questions. Sarah noticed that James answered each query with serious consideration, never dismissing their curiosity as childish or unimportant. "Your daughters are observant," he commented during a brief rest. "Good trait in this country." "They get that from their father," Sarah replied automatically, then felt a familiar pang of grief. William had been gone barely 2 months, yet sometimes it felt as if he had slipped years into the past, separated from them by a chasm of hardship and changed circumstances. James simply nodded, offering neither platitudes nor questions about her loss. His reticence, which she had initially interpreted as aloofness, increasingly seemed like a form of respect for her grief, for her privacy, for her dignity as a woman facing impossible circumstances. By mid-afternoon, as promised, they reached James's cabin. Unlike the crude shelter they'd left behind, this structure stood as testament to skilled craftsmanship. Built of substantial logs with a pitched roof designed to shed snow, it nestled against a rocky outcropping that protected it from the worst of the northern winds. "It's beautiful," Sarah murmured as they approached. "It's practical," James corrected, though she thought she detected a hint of pride in his tone. "My father taught me that good building saves lives in Montana winters." The cabin's interior revealed the same attention to detail. A central stone fireplace provided both heat and cooking space, with sleeping platforms built along one wall and shelves of supplies lining another. Everything had its place: tools, weapons, foodstuffs, medicines, arranged with military precision. Most surprising to Sarah was the small bookshelf near one sleeping platform, containing perhaps 24 well-worn volumes. She couldn't help but glance at the titles: Thoreau's Walden, several Shakespeare plays, books on natural history, medicine, and surprisingly poetry. "You read Whitman?" she asked, surprised to see Leaves of Grass among his collection. Something like embarrassment flickered across James's face. Words matter out here. Good ones should be kept close. Before she could respond, he turned away to prepare a fire, and soon the cabin filled with welcome warmth. The twins, exhausted from the journey, fell asleep almost immediately on the pine needle stuffed mattress James provided. As evening closed in and the storm's second wave began to batter the cabin walls, Sarah realized that for the first time in weeks she felt something approaching security. The feeling was as disorienting as it was welcome, to suddenly have shelter, food, and protection after so long managing alone. "Thank you," she said simply, watching James prepare a meal of venison stew with dried vegetables. "For all of this." He paused in his work, regarding her with those unsettlingly direct grey eyes. "Your children remind me of myself at their age," he said after a moment. "Caught between worlds, belonging to both and neither." The observation startled her. "What do you mean?" "They're half Mitchell," he replied, returning to his cooking. "But the Mitchells don't claim them, do they?" Sarah stiffened. "How much do you know about my situation, Mr. Running Wolf?" "James," he corrected quietly, "and I know enough. Frederick Mitchell's reputation extends throughout the territory. His treatment of his son's widow and children is—" He paused, selecting his words carefully, consistent with his character. A cold anger rose in Sarah's chest. "You speak as if you're familiar with the family." "I've scouted for them," he acknowledged with a slight nod. "Guided cattle drives through Blackfoot territory, tracked rustlers. Frederick Mitchell pays well for services, but holds little respect for those he considers beneath him. His eyes met hers again. Which is most people. The casual revelation that James had worked for her father-in-law transformed Sarah's understanding of their situation. Was this rescue truly chance? Or had Frederick somehow orchestrated it, perhaps paying this scout to ensure she and the twins had truly left Mitchell lands? Did Frederick send you to find us? She demanded, rising to her feet despite her exhaustion. James's expression darkened. No, and I would not have accepted such a task. Then how? I left Mitchell employment 2 years ago, he interrupted, his voice hardening. After he ordered his men to burn a Blackfoot hunting camp they found on his grazing land. Women and children were there. I refused to lead them to it. He stirred the stew with more force than necessary. The Mitchells don't know where I live now, and I prefer it that way. The tension in his shoulders and the controlled anger in his voice convinced Sarah of his sincerity. Whatever his connection to the Mitchells had been, it was clearly severed. And, not amicably, I'm sorry, she offered quietly, for questioning your motives. James's posture relaxed slightly. You're protecting your children. Never apologize for that. He ladled stew into a wooden bowl and handed it to her. Eat. The storm will keep us here for days. Questions can wait until you've regained your strength. As Sarah accepted the food, their fingers brushed again, and she was struck by the same impression as before, of strength tempered by unexpected gentleness. In the firelight, with his guard momentarily lowered, James Running Wolf appeared less the hardened frontier scout and more a man shaped by the same forces that had upended her own life: prejudice, loss, and the struggle to find one's place between conflicting worlds. They ate in silence, the howling blizzard and the twins' soft breathing, the only sounds in the lamplit cabin. Outside, winter reclaimed the wilderness with unforgiving force. Inside, an unlikely sanctuary had formed. Temporary, fragile, but for now, enough. Days stretched into a week as the blizzard's fury continued unabated, transforming the Montana wilderness into an impenetrable white fortress. Inside James Running Wolf's cabin, a strange domestic rhythm emerged, one born of necessity, yet evolving into something neither Sarah nor James had anticipated. The twins recovered with remarkable speed, their resilient young bodies responding to proper nutrition, warmth, and the herbal remedies James prepared. Hannah's cough subsided within days, while Eliza's frostbitten toes healed without the blackening that Sarah had fearfully anticipated. By the 4th day, both girls were restless with pent-up energy, confined as they were to the cabin's interior. They need occupation, James observed one morning, watching the twins fidget through breakfast. Idle hands breed discontent. Before Sarah could respond, he crossed to a trunk near his bed and extracted several items: small pieces of leather, sinew thread, colored glass beads, and smooth wooden sticks. With the girls gathered around him at the table, he demonstrated how to create simple leather pouches, showing them how to punch holes along the edges and lace them with sinew. For your treasures, he explained, placing a few colorful beads in Hannah's palm. Every child needs a place for special things. Sarah, mending a torn sleeve by the fire, watched this interaction with mingled surprise and appreciation. The taciturn scout who had seemed so intimidating when they first met had revealed an unexpected gentleness with children. You're good with them, she commented later, after the twins had fallen asleep, proudly clutching their half-finished pouches. James looked up from where he was oiling a rifle near the door. Children are honest, he said simply. They judge by actions, not appearances or rumors. The observation carried an undercurrent of bitterness that prompted Sarah to ask, "Is that why you live so far from town? Because of judgments?" He was silent, long enough that she thought he might not answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was measured, as if each word carried weight. "There are 3 places for a man of mixed blood in this territory," he said, focusing on his task. "Reservation land, where the white part of me is suspect. Town margins, where I'd be tolerated for my skills but never accepted. Or here," he gestured to the cabin around them, "where judgment stops at that door." "It sounds lonely," Sarah ventured. James met her gaze directly. "Lonely and alone aren't the same thing, Mrs. Mitchell." "Sarah," she corrected quietly, "if I'm to call you James." A nearly imperceptible nod acknowledged this small step toward familiarity. "I choose solitude," he continued. "Your isolation was forced upon you. That's the difference." His perceptiveness unnerved her. In the week they'd sheltered together, Sarah had revealed little about the circumstances that had driven her from Thornfield Manor. Yet somehow, James had pieced together the outline of her story. Perhaps from his previous knowledge of the Mitchells, perhaps from observation. "Did you know my husband?" she asked suddenly. James set aside his rifle, contemplating the question. "We weren't acquainted socially," he replied with a hint of dry humor. "But William Mitchell hired me twice, once to guide a hunting expedition, once to track a grizzly that had been killing Mitchell cattle. What did you think of him? He was—" James paused, clearly choosing his words with care. "Different from his father. Less harsh in his judgments, more willing to see value in things Frederick dismissed." His eyes met hers briefly. "Like a schoolteacher from Pennsylvania." The reference to her background startled Sarah. "How did you—" "Your accent," he explained. "Eastern educated. You mentioned teaching the girls their letters. And there's a book in your satchel stamped with Pennsylvania Normal School." He shrugged slightly. Trackers noticed details. Sarah wasn't sure whether to be impressed or disturbed by his observations. Before she could decide, James continued. "Unexpectedly, William spoke of you during the hunt, with pride. A shadow of something like respect crossed his scarred face. That's rare among men of his station." The revelation pierced Sarah's composure. Since William's death, the Mitchell family's rejection had begun to poison her memories, making her question whether her marriage had been built on genuine affection or merely William's rebellion against his domineering father. To hear from this unlikely source that William had spoken well of her to others brought a rush of emotion she struggled to contain. "Thank you for telling me that," she managed finally. James nodded once, then returned to his rifle maintenance, seeming to understand her need for privacy with these rekindled memories. The storm finally broke on the 8th day, revealing a transformed landscape glittering beneath a brilliant blue sky. James spent the morning clearing snow from around the cabin and checking his various caches and traps, while Sarah and the twins ventured outside for the first time in over a week. The fresh air and sunshine worked magic on their spirits. Hannah and Eliza promptly began constructing a snow fort under Sarah's watchful eye, their laughter ringing across the clearing. For a precious hour, they were simply children at play, the trauma of recent weeks temporarily forgotten. When James returned, dragging a small sled loaded with firewood, he paused to observe their snowball battle with evident amusement. "Your tactics need refinement," he called to the twins, who had Sarah pinned behind a snowbank. "Show us!" Eliza challenged, her dark eyes sparkling with mischief. To Sarah's astonishment, James propped his axe against the cabin wall and proceeded to give the girls a serious lesson in snow fort construction and strategic positioning. Before long, he was drafted into their game, helping them build an elaborate snow structure while explaining concepts of defense and assault in terms that transformed their play into a learning experience. Sarah, watching from the sidelines, was struck by how naturally James interacted with the twins, never talking down to them, answering their endless questions with patience, showing them skills with the assumption that they were fully capable of mastering them despite their age and gender. It was so different from Frederick Mitchell's stiff formality with his granddaughters, whom he had treated as ornamental rather than practical beings destined for marriage rather than accomplishment. Even William, loving father though he'd been, had sometimes defaulted to the conventional wisdom that certain knowledge wasn't suitable for young ladies. That evening, as they gathered around the fire after a simple but satisfying supper, Hannah asked the question that had clearly been brewing all day. "Mr. James, were you a real soldier? Is that how you got your scar?" "Hannah!" Sarah admonished, embarrassed by her daughter's directness. James, however, didn't seem offended. "Not exactly a soldier," he answered, his tone matter-of-fact. "I was a scout for the army. I found paths, tracked people and animals, translated when needed." "And the scar?" Hannah persisted, her natural curiosity overwhelming her mother's attempt at enforcing politeness. James's hand rose unconsciously to the mark that ran from temple to jaw. "This is from before, when I was younger than you." Something distant entered his eyes. "My father was away trading. 3 men came to our cabin, decided a half-breed boy and his Indian mother shouldn't be living on white land." The cabin fell silent, even the twins sensing the gravity behind his simple statement. "They hurt you," Eliza said softly, her perceptiveness belying her 5 years. James nodded once. "And my mother, she fought them, 3 grown men with nothing but a cooking knife." A complicated emotion crossed his face, pride mingled with old grief. "She saved me, but the damage was done, to both of us." "What happened to the men?" Sarah asked, drawn into the story despite herself. "My father tracked them when he returned," James replied, his gaze fixed on the fire. "He'd been a boxer in his youth in Ireland, had hands like sledgehammers." A grim satisfaction entered his voice. "They lived, but they never came near our land again." The story hung in the air between them, a truth offered without embellishment, revealing more about James Running Wolf than days of conversation had managed. Sarah recognized it for what it was, a deliberate lowering of barriers, an extension of trust. "Is that why you helped us?" Hannah asked, making connections with a child's directness. "Because someone hurt you and your mama too?" James looked startled, as if the parallel hadn't occurred to him. "Perhaps," he acknowledged after a moment, "or perhaps because out here, turning away from those in need is a luxury no one can afford." Later, after the twins had been tucked into their bed on the sleeping platform, Sarah found James outside, standing in the moonlight that transformed the snow-covered clearing into a silver landscape. He was motionless, face turned toward the star-filled sky as if reading messages in its patterns. "Thank you," she said quietly, drawing her shawl tighter against the cold, "for sharing your story with the girls. I know it couldn't have been easy." He didn't turn, but she sensed his awareness of her presence. "Children need truth," he replied, his breath forming clouds in the frigid air. "Even difficult truth, especially when the world has already shown them its harshness." "Is that what your mother taught you?" A barely perceptible nod. "She believed silence breeds fear, and fear breeds hatred. Better to name the danger, understand it, than pretend it doesn't exist." "She sounds remarkable," Sarah offered, moving to stand beside him. She was. James finally turned to look at her, his profile sharp against the night sky. "As are you." The unexpected compliment caught Sarah off guard. "I'm just doing what any mother would," she demurred. "No." The single word carried conviction. "Many would have broken under what you've endured. Instead, you fought. For yourself, for your daughters. Without self-pity, without surrender." His eyes held hers, uncompromising in their assessment. "That's remarkable, Sarah Mitchell." Before she could formulate a response, he continued, his tone shifting to practical matters. The trails to Sweetwater Creek will be passable in 3 days if the weather holds. I'll guide you there as promised. The reminder of their imminent departure created a curious hollowness in Sarah's chest. During their forced confinement, the cabin had become a sanctuary, not just from the physical dangers of winter, but from the judgment and rejection they had faced at Thornfield Manor. What if my cousin isn't in Sweetwater? She voiced the fear that had plagued her since their desperate departure. I haven't had contact with Martha in over 2 years. Her husband might have moved on, or... She couldn't bring herself to enumerate the many possibilities life on the frontier presented for sudden change or tragedy. James considered this with his characteristic thoroughness. Then we create a new plan, he stated simply. One step, then the next. That's how survival works. His calm assurance steadied her, one step, then the next. It was both practical advice and a philosophy that had seemingly guided his own complex life. As they stood together in the moonlight, an unspoken understanding formed between them, an alliance born of shared hardship and growing respect. Whatever awaited them in Sweetwater Creek, whatever future unfolded beyond this temporary refuge, they had each recognized something valuable in the other: resilience, integrity, and the courage to forge a path where none had existed before. Sarah turned, her face toward the star-strewn sky, allowing herself to absorb the stillness of the moment. For the first time since William's death, tomorrow didn't loom as a threat, but as a possibility. One step, then the next. Perhaps that was enough for now. The preparations for their journey to Sweetwater Creek began in earnest the following day. James meticulously inspected and repaired his larger sled, reinforcing the runners and fashioning a cover of oiled canvas to protect the twins from wind and snow. Sarah, determined not to be helpless, took inventory of their meager possessions and prepared what food she could for the journey. "We'll need proper clothing for all of you," James announced on the second morning, evaluating their readiness with a critical eye. He disappeared into the storage area at the back of the cabin, returning with armfuls of garments that he laid out carefully on the table. "These were my mother's," he explained, unfolding a pair of deerskin leggings lined with rabbit fur. "Altered for white-style dresses, but made for warmth, not appearance." He hesitated, then added, "If you find it acceptable to wear them." Sarah ran her fingers over the soft leather, noting the beautiful quill work decorating the seams. The craftsmanship was exquisite, far superior to the cheap cotton dress she currently wore, now tattered and thin from weeks of constant wear. "I'd be honored," she replied sincerely, recognizing both the practical necessity and the significant gesture James was making in offering his mother's clothing. For the twins, he had smaller garments. Not his mother's, he explained, but items he had traded for over the years, thinking they might be useful someday. They were traditional Blackfoot children's clothing, buckskin dresses with attached leggings, miniature fur-lined moccasins, and small caps made from marten pelts. "Pretty!" Eliza exclaimed, stroking a dress decorated with geometric patterns in dyed porcupine quills. "Warm," James corrected, though a hint of pleasure at her appreciation showed in his eyes. Fashion matters little when the wind bites. The morning of their planned departure dawned clear and cold, the thermometer outside James's cabin registering 15 degrees below zero. Inside, the atmosphere was charged with a mixture of anticipation and unspoken regret. The twins, excited for the adventure ahead, but sad to leave the cabin that had become a safe haven, flitted about in their new clothing, helping to pack with more enthusiasm than efficiency. Sarah, dressed in her borrowed Blackfoot garments, was startled when she caught James staring at her with an unreadable expression. "Is something wrong?" she asked, suddenly self-conscious. He shook his head slightly. "You remind me of her," he said quietly. Not in appearance, but in spirit. My mother adapted too, took what she needed from both worlds without shame. Before Sarah could respond to this unexpected comparison, a sound from outside froze them. Both, the distant but unmistakable jingle of harness bells approaching from the trail that led to the main road. James moved to the window with alarming speed, his posture instantly alert. "Visitors," he said, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "Two sleds, men with rifles." Fear clutched at Sarah's throat. "Mitchell men?" "Can't tell yet." James grabbed his rifle and checked it with practiced efficiency. "But no one comes this far without purpose." He turned to Sarah, his expression deadly serious. "Take the children to the root cellar. Now." Sarah didn't waste time questioning him. Gathering the startled twins, she hurried to the trapdoor James had indicated, a cleverly disguised opening in the floor near the pantry area that led to a small underground space where James stored root vegetables and preserved meat. "Like a secret hideaway," Hannah whispered as they descended the rough wooden steps. "Yes, darling," Sarah murmured, trying to keep fear from her voice. "A very important game of hide and seek. We must be absolutely silent, no matter what we hear." The root cellar was cramped but clean, lined with shelves containing preserved foods. A narrow air shaft provided ventilation, and James had thoughtfully left a lantern and matches. Once the twins were settled on a folded blanket in the corner, Sarah climbed back up to secure the trapdoor from above, as James had instructed. She reached the main floor just as a loud knock rattled the cabin door. "Running Wolf," a male voice called. "We know you're in there. Open up, Mitchell business." Sarah froze halfway across the room, her eyes meeting James's in silent alarm. "Stay out of sight," he mouthed, motioning her toward the sleeping area, which was partially screened by a hanging blanket. Safely concealed, Sarah watched through a small gap as James opened the door, his manner deliberately casual, though he kept his rifle visibly in hand. "Caldwell," he greeted the foremost visitor with cool recognition. "Long ride from Mitchell land." Two men stood on the threshold, bundled against the cold, but unmistakably armed. The first, Caldwell, was a stocky, red-faced man with a thick moustache frosted with ice. His companion was younger, taller, with the lean, hungry look of a predator. "Looking for Mitchell property," Caldwell stated, attempting to peer past James into the cabin. "Got reports you might be harboring it." "I don't work for the Mitchells anymore," James replied evenly, "and I don't harbor their property." The younger man spat tobacco juice onto the snow. "We ain't talking about cattle breed. We're looking for the Mitchell widow and those half-breed brats of hers." Sarah's hand flew to her mouth to stifle a gasp. James's expression hardened, but his voice remained controlled. "Haven't seen any widows or children," he replied. "Now state your business plainly or leave my property." Caldwell's pig-like eyes narrowed. "Frederick Mitchell has reason to believe his daughter-in-law is heading to Sweetwater Creek with his grandchildren, wants them intercepted and brought back to Thornfield." "Why would I know anything about that?" James asked, his tone deliberately bored. "Because," the younger man interjected, "word reached Thornfield that a woman and two young'uns were spotted heading north during the last storm. Trail went cold, but someone remembered you keep a cabin out this way." His thin lips curved in an unpleasant smile. "And everyone knows how you favor half-breeds." The slur hung in the air like a challenge. James's knuckles whitened on his rifle, but his voice betrayed no emotion when he responded. "If that's all, you've had a long, wasted journey. I suggest you start back before the afternoon snow begins." Caldwell stepped forward, one boot crossing the threshold. "We'll just have a look around first." James raised his rifle slightly, not aiming, but positioning it with clear intent. "No," he said simply. "You won't." The tension crackled between them, an imminent violence that made Sarah's breath catch. From her hiding place, she could see both men's hands hovering near their holstered pistols. "You threatening Mitchell men?" Caldwell growled. "I'm stating facts," James replied, his voice deceptively calm. "This is my land. You weren't invited. The woman and children you seek aren't here. Any move to enter my home without permission will be considered hostile." The standoff stretched, neither side willing to back down. Finally, the younger man tugged at Caldwell's sleeve. "Come on, Joe. Ain't worth dying in this frozen hellhole. We'll catch up to them at Sweetwater if they're heading that way." Caldwell's face darkened with frustrated rage, but survival instinct eventually won out over pride. "This ain't finished, running wolf," he snarled, stepping back. "Mitchell don't forget those who cross him." "Neither do I," James replied. His meaning unmistakable. Only when the jingle of harness bells had faded completely into the distance did James lower his rifle and close the door. He crossed to the window, watching until the Mitchell men were completely out of sight, then turned to Sarah, who had emerged from her hiding place. "They're gone," he confirmed, "but they'll be watching the trail to Sweetwater." Sarah's mind reeled, with implications. How did Frederick know where we were headed? And why come after us now? He wanted us gone. James's expression was grim as he helped her open the trapdoor to retrieve the twins. "Not gone," he corrected. "Under control. There's a difference." Once the girls were settled by the fire with a small treat to calm their nerves after the unexpected confinement, James explained his theory. Frederick Mitchell rules his family like a feudal lord. When your husband died, he expected you to accept whatever terms he dictated. James's perceptive grey eyes studied her face. Instead, you left entirely, taking his grandchildren, his son's blood, beyond his reach. "But he disowned us," Sarah protested. "Called the girls half-breed bastards to my face." "Words meant to wound and control," James replied. "Not necessarily his true assessment." He stoked the fire pensively. "The Mitchells are obsessed with legacy. Frederick's other son, Robert, has no children yet, correct?" Sarah nodded, remembering her cold, ambitious brother-in-law and his equally calculating wife. "Then Hannah and Eliza are the only continuation of the Mitchell bloodline," James continued. "Frederick may have regretted letting his temper drive away his only grandchildren, or perhaps he simply can't bear the thought of them beyond his influence." The explanation aligned with what Sarah knew of her father-in-law, his ruthless determination to control everyone and everything connected to the Mitchell name. A cold fear settled in her stomach as she realized what this meant. "We can't go to Sweetwater," she whispered. "They'll be waiting." James nodded, his expression thoughtful rather than defeated. "The original plan must change, but they've inadvertently given us valuable information." "What do you mean?" "They're watching the direct route, expecting us to travel openly." A strategic glint appeared in his eyes. "So we do neither." Over the next hour, as the twins napped after their frightening experience, James outlined a bold but calculated plan. Instead of heading directly to Sweetwater Creek, they would travel west and then south, circling through less frequented mountain passes that James knew intimately from his years as a scout. It would add days to their journey, but would bypass the Mitchell men entirely, and instead of Sweetwater, he continued, spreading a worn map across the table, we make for Fort Harrison. The army commander there, Colonel Blackwood, owes me a favor. He can provide official protection while we determine if your cousin is still in the territory. Sarah studied the revised route, noting the challenging terrain they would need to traverse. It won't be easy with children, she observed. No, James agreed candidly. But the alternative is worse. If the Mitchell men take you back to Thornfield, I'd rather die, Sarah interjected with unexpected vehemence. And I mean that literally. I'll not subject my daughters to Frederick Mitchell's idea of family ever again. Her fierce declaration seemed to confirm something for James. He nodded once, rolling up the map with decisive movements. We leave tonight, he stated, under cover of darkness. Take only what's essential. I'll prepare the sled differently, smaller, lighter, designed for speed rather than comfort. His eyes met hers, seeking confirmation of her resolve. "It will be difficult." "So is everything worthwhile," Sarah replied, drawing on a newfound well of determination. "We're ready for difficult, James. The girls are stronger than they look." "So am I." As they began repacking for this more dangerous journey, Sarah found herself examining the situation with strange clarity. The Mitchell men's appearance had transformed their circumstances, elevating a simple journey to Sweetwater Creek into something far more significant. A final, decisive break from the Mitchell family's toxic influence. James worked with focused intensity, altering their supplies, preparing weapons, even changing the twins' bright-colored caps for more subdued ones that would blend into the winter landscape. Every modification reflected not just practical consideration, but strategic thinking, the mind of a man accustomed to operating in hostile territory. "Why are you really helping us?" Sarah asked quietly as they worked. "The truth, James. This goes far beyond wilderness hospitality now." He paused in his task, meeting her gaze directly. "Because I recognize the look in your eyes," he said finally. "The same one my mother had when she decided no one would define her worth or her children's future. That look deserves alliance, not abandonment." The simple honesty of his answer resonated with something fundamental in Sarah's soul, a recognition that transcended their different backgrounds and experiences. They were unlikely allies brought together by circumstance, but united now by a shared understanding of what truly mattered: the freedom to determine one's own path, the right to protect one's children from those who would diminish or control them. As darkness fell, they made final preparations by lamplight. The twins, sensing the gravity of the situation even without understanding all its implications, assisted quietly, following instructions with unusual solemnity. "Are the bad men coming back?" Eliza asked, as Sarah helped her into her travel clothes. "No, sweetheart," Sarah assured her, smoothing her daughter's dark hair. "Mr. James knows a special path they can't follow. We're going on a secret journey." Hannah, always the more perceptive of the twins, studied her mother's face carefully. "Because we're special, right? That's why they want us back." The question caught Sarah off guard with its insight. "Yes," she admitted after a moment, "you are special, but not for the reasons they think." As the cabin fell silent except for the crackling fire, Sarah contemplated the journey ahead. They were about to venture into the heart of the Montana winter, pursued by men who would not easily abandon their mission, guided by a mixed-blood scout who had become, against all probability, their most trusted ally. The odds were daunting, the dangers real, yet Sarah felt a curious sense of rightness in their course. For the first time since William's death, they were not simply reacting to circumstances, but actively charting their own path, however perilous it might prove. They left the cabin in the darkest hour before dawn, when even nocturnal creatures had sought shelter from the biting cold. The night sky blazed with stars, their cold light reflecting off the snow to create an eerie, shadowless landscape that stretched endlessly before them. James had reconfigured the sled completely, creating a lighter, more streamlined vessel built for maneuverability rather than comfort. The twins were secured in the center, wrapped in layers of furs, with only their eyes visible, while essential supplies were strapped beneath and behind them. James would pull from the front using a harness he'd fashioned across his chest and shoulders, while Sarah would push and guide from behind. "Remember," James instructed as they prepared to depart, his breath forming dense clouds in the frigid air, "we leave no clear trail. Step where I step when possible. We move only in moonlight and dawn light. No fires except in sheltered places." He handed Sarah a small revolver, a compact Colt that fit neatly in her gloved hand. 5 shots, he explained, meeting her eyes to ensure she understood. "Last resort only, but know it's there. The weight of the weapon was both reassuring and terrifying. Sarah had never fired a gun, though she'd watched William do so many times during their marriage. The implicit message in James's gift was clear. Their situation had escalated beyond mere survival in harsh elements. They were now actively evading human predators. "I pray I won't need it," she said, tucking the revolver into a specially sewn pocket in her deerskin coat. "Prayer has its place," James replied pragmatically. "Preparation has another." Their path led initially west rather than south, following a narrow game trail that wound through dense pine forest where the snow lay shallower beneath the canopy of evergreen boughs. James set a challenging pace, taking advantage of the good weather and their fresh strength. The sled runners whispered over the hard-packed snow, the only sound in the sleeping forest, besides their measured breathing and the occasional question from the twins, who treated the nighttime journey as a grand adventure rather than a desperate flight. "Look, Mama," Hannah whispered excitedly, pointing skyward where the aurora borealis had begun to dance, rippling curtains of green and white light shimmering across the northern horizon. "The sky is magic." "Spirit lights," James told them, pausing briefly, "to let them admire the spectacle. My mother's people believe their ancestors dancing across the heavens. Is your mama up there dancing?" Eliza asked with a child's directness. A rare smile softened James's scarred face. "Perhaps. She always loved to dance." By dawn, they had covered nearly 8 miles, a remarkable distance considering the conditions and their burdens. James led them to a sheltered ravine where a small stream flowed beneath a ceiling of ice, its gurgling music masked by the frozen crust above. "We rest here," he announced, helping Sarah guide the sled into a natural alcove formed by an overhanging rock and several fallen trees. 4 hours, no more. While James secured their temporary camp and set snares in hopes of catching rabbits for their evening meal, Sarah tended to the twins, ensuring they drank warm tea from a small flask James had prepared before their departure, and ate dried meat, and pemmican to maintain their strength. "Are we running away from the bad men?" Hannah asked between bites, her blue eyes, so like William's, serious and thoughtful. Sarah considered how to answer truthfully without frightening her daughters. "Unnecessarily. We're taking a different path," she said finally, "one that's safer for us, even if it's a bit harder." "Because Grandfather Mitchell wants to keep us in that big house forever," Eliza added, surprising Sarah with her perception, "and make us wear those scratchy dresses." "You didn't like Thornfield Manor?" Sarah asked, curious about her daughters' perspective on the grand estate that had been their home. Eliza shook her head emphatically. "Grandfather was mean to you, and he wouldn't let us play with the horses or go in the mud." "I liked the library," Hannah admitted, "but not when Grandfather was in it. He made the books seem sad." Their simple observations struck Sarah deeply. She had worried about the emotional impact of their sudden departure from Thornfield, the loss of material comfort and security. Yet here were her daughters, expressing relief rather than regret at leaving the Mitchell estate. They had perceived, with children's instinctive sensitivity, the poisonous atmosphere beneath the mansion's opulent surface. "Mr. James isn't mean," Eliza continued, lowering her voice as if sharing a secret. "He teaches us things instead of telling us to be quiet." Before Sarah could respond, James returned to their small camp, bringing several pine boughs that he arranged as windbreaks around their resting place. If he had overheard Eliza's assessment, he gave no indication. "Sleep while you can," he advised, settling himself at the edge of their shelter where he could watch both their back trail and the path ahead. "We move again at midday." Despite her exhaustion, Sarah found sleep elusive. Her mind raced with calculations and contingencies. What if the Mitchell men discovered their alternate route? What if James's army contact at Fort Harrison refused to help them? What if her cousin was no longer in Sweetwater Creek? "Your thinking is loud enough to scare game," James observed quietly, startling her from her troubled reverie. Sarah sat up, careful not to disturb the sleeping twins. "There are too many uncertainties," she whispered. James nodded, accepting her concern rather than dismissing it. "The first rule of survival: control what you can, accept what you cannot." He gestured toward the horizon where thin clouds had begun to gather. "I can't change the weather, but I can choose our shelter. I can't prevent the Mitchell men from searching, but I can select paths they won't think to follow." "And what can I control?" Sarah asked, drawn into his practical philosophy. "Your resolve," he answered without hesitation. "Your willingness to adapt. Your daughter's understanding of what matters." He met her eyes directly. "All things I've observed you doing already." The simple vote of confidence steadied her more than any elaborate reassurance could have. James wasn't offering false comfort or empty promises, just an honest assessment of their situation and her capacity to face it. "Thank you," she said simply. He acknowledged her words with a slight nod, then unexpectedly added, "William chose." Well, the reference to her late husband caught Sarah off guard. "What do you mean?" "When men of wealth marry, they often choose decorative wives, beautiful but fragile like hothouse flowers." James's gaze was appraising but respectful. "You have thorns beneath your blossoms, necessary for survival in harsh climates." The unorthodox compliment brought a surprised laugh to Sarah's lips, perhaps her first genuine laughter since William's death. "I've never been compared to a thorn bush before," she remarked, feeling some of her anxiety dissipate. "Blackfoot have many stories about the rose bush," James replied, "how its beauty attracts, but its thorns teach respect." A hint of amusement touched his usually solemn features. "An admirable plant." This glimpse of dry humor from the taciturn scout revealed yet another unexpected facet of his complex character. Sarah was struck by how thoroughly she'd misjudged him upon their first meeting, seeing only the intimidating exterior, missing entirely the perceptive mind and surprisingly gentle spirit that had been revealed during their time together. As promised, they resumed their journey at midday, leaving their temporary shelter as pristine as they'd found it. Another of James's rules for evading pursuit. They traveled now through more difficult terrain, skirting the edge of a ridge that offered sweeping views of the valley below while providing the cover of scattered pine groves. "Look there," James said suddenly, pausing their progress and pointing toward the main trail far below. Mitchell men. Sarah's heart lurched as she made out the distant figures, 3 sleds moving rapidly along the direct route to Sweetwater Creek, exactly where they would have been traveling under the original plan. "They've increased their numbers," James observed, his expression hardening. "Frederick must want his grandchildren back very badly, or he wants to punish me for defying him," Sarah countered, knowing her father-in-law's vindictive nature. James nodded, acknowledging the possibility. Either way, our choice to take this path was wise. He studied the distant figures a moment, longer, then gestured for them to continue. "They're moving fast, but in the wrong direction. Each mile they travel is to our advantage." The day's journey proved more arduous than the night's had been. The terrain grew increasingly rugged, requiring them to portage the sled across rocky outcroppings where snow had been swept away by wind. Several times they encountered obstacles that forced lengthy detours. A fallen tree too massive to navigate around, a section of trail obliterated by a recent avalanche, a steep descent too treacherous to attempt with their precious cargo. Through it all, the twins maintained remarkable spirits, treating each challenge as part of an elaborate game. When the sled tipped over during a particularly difficult crossing, spilling them into a soft snowbank, they erupted in giggles rather than tears. When hunger gnawed at their bellies as the afternoon stretched into evening, they invented stories about the feast they would enjoy at journey's end. Their resilience both amazed and humbled Sarah, so young to have endured so much, their father's death, their grandfather's rejection, near starvation in the wilderness, and now this desperate flight, yet they adapted with a flexibility adults often couldn't manage. "They're like willow saplings," James commented when Sarah expressed this thought during a brief rest. "They bend with the storm rather than breaking, a valuable trait." By sunset, exhaustion had begun to take its toll on all of them. James's steps, so sure and measured throughout the day, occasionally faltered. Sarah's arms and back ached from hours of pushing the sled. Even the twins had fallen silent, their energy finally depleted. Just as Sarah was wondering how much longer they could continue, James led them into a stand of massive cedar trees, their spreading branches creating a natural cathedral where the snow lay much shallower than in the surrounding forest. "We camp here tonight," he announced, surveying the area with approval. "Good protection, limited approaches, dry wood available." To Sarah's surprise, he produced a small folding shovel from his pack and began to dig into the snow beneath the largest cedar, creating a pit about 4 feet across. "Cedar pit shelter," he explained, seeing her questioning look. "Blackfoot hunting technique. Fire below ground level contains light. Smoke rises through branches." Working together, they soon had a serviceable shelter. The pit lined with cedar boughs, a small, carefully managed fire at its center, providing heat without telltale smoke or visible flame, the sled positioned to block the wind and reflect warmth back into their sanctuary. As darkness fell completely, they shared a simple meal of jerky, hard biscuits James had prepared at the cabin, and tea brewed from pine needles. Rich in vitamins, he explained, to ward off winter sickness. The twins, revived somewhat by food and warmth, bombarded James with questions about animals whose tracks they'd observed during the day's journey. With unexpected patience, he identified each creature, explaining its habits and significance in Blackfoot tradition. The fox was clever, but sometimes too proud of his tricks. The snowshoe hare changed colors with the seasons, teaching adaptability. The wolverine was fierce beyond its size, commanding respect from much larger animals. Sarah, watching this interaction from across the small fire, was struck by James's natural teaching ability. He neither simplified excessively nor used unnecessary complexity, meeting the children at their level while still challenging them to stretch their understanding. "You would have made a fine father," she observed quietly after the twins had finally succumbed to sleep, nestled together like puppies in a nest of furs. Something complicated moved behind James's grey eyes, a fleeting expression of loss or longing quickly mastered. "That path wasn't mine to walk," he said simply. His response held such finality that Sarah didn't press further, sensing boundaries around certain aspects of his life that he preferred not to discuss. Instead, they sat in companionable silence, listening to the wind moving through the cedar branches high above and the occasional distant cry of a hunting owl. "How much farther to Fort Harrison?" Sarah finally asked, studying the map James had spread across his knees. 3 days if weather holds," he replied, tracing their route with a calloused finger. "Here we are now. Tomorrow we cross Blacktail Ridge, then follow Serpent Creek Valley south." His finger moved across the parchment. "Most difficult section is here. Granite Pass. Narrow trail, steep drops. We'll need clear weather to attempt it." The clinical assessment of challenges ahead somehow steadied Sarah rather than alarming her. James's unflinching realism, his refusal to sugarcoat difficulties or offer false reassurances, had become a source of strength rather than anxiety. And if the Mitchell men realized their mistake, if they double back, James considered this with typical thoroughness, possible but unlikely in the immediate future. "They're committed to their current course." He folded the map carefully. "Besides, they're looking for a woman and children traveling openly toward Sweetwater, not—" He gestured to her buckskin-clad form. "A Blackfoot family moving through." Hunting territories. It was a perspective Sarah hadn't considered, that their adopted clothing and unconventional route provided camouflage beyond mere physical concealment. To anyone observing from a distance, they would appear to be a native family on seasonal rounds, not fugitives from one of Montana's wealthiest ranching dynasties. As Sarah settled into her bedroll that night, positioning herself protectively beside her daughters, she reflected on how thoroughly their identities had been transformed in the weeks since fleeing Thornfield Manor. The refined, somewhat sheltered doctor's widow had become a wilderness survivor, capable of traveling miles through snow and cold. Her pampered daughters had revealed unexpected reservoirs of strength and adaptability, and James Running Wolf, the intimidating breed, whom proper society dismissed as neither fully civilized nor fully savage, had proven himself more honorable, more trustworthy, and more genuinely civilized than the wealthy white patriarch who had cast them out. The irony was not lost on her as she drifted towards sleep beneath a canopy of ancient cedars, their massive trunks standing like sentinels against the night. Somewhere far below, Frederick Mitchell's men searched for them along established trails, never imagining that the objects of their pursuit had ventured into territories where Mitchell money and Mitchell influence held no sway. Here, in this primal landscape where survival depended on skill rather than social position, they had found not just refuge, but a strange kind of freedom. Whatever uncertainties the future held, Sarah knew with bone-deep certainty that they could never return to the gilded cage of Thornfield Manor, not after experiencing this hard-won liberation. The crossing of Blacktail Ridge proved even more arduous than James had predicted. What began as a clear, cold morning deteriorated rapidly as clouds rolled in from the west, bringing stinging pellets of ice that drove horizontally on gusting winds. The exposed spine of the ridge offered no shelter from the elements, forcing them to press forward through increasingly hazardous conditions. "Keep your head down," James called over the howling wind, his voice barely audible despite their proximity. "Storm's intensifying." Sarah leaned into the gale, one arm shielding her face, the other gripping the sled with white-knuckled determination. The twins were completely covered now, nestled beneath layers of fur, with only a small breathing hole James had ingeniously designed to prevent snow accumulation while allowing fresh air. The path had narrowed to a treacherous shelf, barely 3 feet wide, with a sheer drop of several hundred feet on their left side. Under normal conditions, James had explained, the crossing was challenging but manageable. In this unexpected squall, it had become perilous. A particularly violent gust slammed into them, nearly knocking Sarah off her feet. She felt the sled shift dangerously toward the precipice and lunged to counterbalance it, her heart seizing with terror at how close they'd come to disaster. James reacted instantly, driving his ice axe into the frozen ground and securing the sled's lead rope around it. "We can't continue in this," he shouted, scanning the ridge ahead. "Need shelter." Through the swirling snow, Sarah could make out nothing but whiteness. No caves, no overhangs, not even the stunted pines that had dotted the earlier portions of the ridge. They were exposed on the mountain's shoulder with a storm intensifying around them and night approaching. For the first time since their flight began, she felt the cold fingers of genuine despair. James, however, was already in motion, unslinging his pack and extracting what appeared to be a large, oiled canvas. With swift, practiced movements, he began constructing a makeshift shelter using the sled as an anchor point, the canvas as a roof, and his ice axe and knife driven into the frozen ground as support posts. "Help me with the sides," he directed, passing Sarah one edge of the canvas. Together, they worked against the gale, piling snow around the shelter's edges to seal them and weighting the canvas with rocks to prevent it from tearing away. Within 10 minutes, they had created a crude but effective refuge, low to the ground to minimize wind resistance, partially dug into the snowpack for insulation, just large enough to accommodate all four of them in close quarters. Once inside, with the entrance securely fastened, the howling of the wind became slightly muffled, though the canvas walls pulsed and strained against their moorings with each powerful gust. James immediately checked on the twins, who emerged wide-eyed but unharmed from their protective cocoon. "Are we going to blow away?" Hannah asked, her voice remarkably steady despite the obvious danger. "No," James replied with simple conviction. "This shelter has protected me in worse storms than this one." He reached into his pack and produced a small metal container. "Now we make heat." Sarah watched in fascination as he assembled a miniature stove of sorts, a shallow tin with carefully punctured holes containing what looked like solidified oil embedded with wicks. When lit, it produced a steady, smokeless flame that radiated, surprising warmth within their confined space. "Trapper's candle," he explained. "Animal fat, mixed with beeswax and cotton fiber, burns clean, 4 hours per tin." The ingenuity of the device, clearly one of James's own making, struck Sarah anew. How many nights had he spent alone in such shelters, weathering storms on remote mountain passes, relying only on his knowledge and preparation for survival? "Will the storm last long?" she asked, helping to distribute dried food rations to the increasingly hungry twins. James cocked his head, listening to the storm's voice with the attention of someone fluent in its language. "Several hours at least. We'll remain here until morning unless conditions improve dramatically." The prospect of spending the night in such close quarters, the shelter was barely 7 feet long by 5 feet wide, might once have discomforted Sarah. Now pragmatism overshadowed propriety. Survival dictated different rules than drawing room etiquette. As if reading her thoughts, James added, "Cold will be our greatest challenge once night falls. We'll need to conserve body heat." The temperature had indeed begun to drop precipitously as afternoon faded toward evening. Outside their fragile sanctuary, the storm continued unabated, driving snow through any minuscule gap in their shelter's construction, creating small drifts that required regular clearing. When the trapper's candle finally burned out, leaving them in near total darkness, James methodically rearranged their sleeping arrangements, creating a communal nest of every available fur, blanket, and outer garment. "Children in center," he directed. "Adults on outside to provide heat and protection." The practicality of the arrangement was undeniable. With the twins sandwiched between them and multiple layers of insulation both beneath and above, they created an island of bearable warmth in the midst of lethal cold. Still, Sarah felt a moment of hesitation as she settled into this intimate arrangement, acutely aware of James's solid presence just inches away across the sleeping children. "This won't last forever," he said quietly, seeming to sense her discomfort. "Just one night in the mountain's grip." His matter-of-fact approach, treating their situation as neither improper nor remarkable, simply necessary, helped Sarah relax into the arrangement. Outside, the wind's howl had taken on an almost animal quality, a keening wail that penetrated even their insulated cocoon. "Sounds angry," Eliza whispered, pressing closer to her mother. "Wind is just wind," James replied from the darkness. "It has no feelings, no intentions. Remember that when fear tries to claim you." "But it sounds like it's crying," Hannah countered, her voice small but determined. There was a thoughtful pause before James responded. "My mother's people have stories about the mountain winds. They say that long ago, the west wind fell in love with a beautiful human woman, but she was frightened by his power and ran away. Now he searches the mountains eternally, calling for his lost love." "That's sad," Eliza commented sleepily. "Some stories are," James acknowledged, "but they help us make sense of the world around us." The simple explanation seemed to satisfy the twins, who soon drifted off to sleep, despite the storm's continuing assault. Sarah, however, remained wakeful, her mind replaying the increasingly unlikely sequence of events that had brought them to this precarious shelter on a mountain ridge. "You should rest," James advised softly, his voice barely audible above the wind. "Tomorrow will demand strength. I keep thinking about how close we came to—" She couldn't finish the sentence. The image of the sled sliding over the precipice, too terrible to articulate. "But we didn't," James replied firmly. "Focus on what is, not what might have been. Another rule of survival." Sarah considered this philosophy, so different from the anxiety-laden thinking that had characterized her life at Thornfield Manor, where every social interaction was analyzed for hidden slights, every business decision scrutinized for potential catastrophe. "How do you remain so calm?" she asked. "Even now, balanced on a mountainside in a blizzard, with Frederick Mitchell's men somewhere behind us." She couldn't see James's expression in the darkness, but his voice carried a hint of self-deprecating humor. "Practice," he said simply. "When you've faced enough true emergencies, you learn to distinguish between inconvenience and catastrophe. And this is a significant inconvenience," he replied without hesitation. "A catastrophe would be if we had no shelter, no food, no path forward. We have all three." His unshakable pragmatism was strangely comforting, not because it minimized their situation, but because it placed it in context. They faced genuine danger, but they also possessed genuine resources to confront it. Gradually, lulled by the rhythmic breathing of her daughters and the strange security of their improvised shelter, Sarah drifted into sleep. She woke to absolute stillness. The wind's constant howl had ceased, replaced by a silence so profound it seemed to press against her ears. Pale light filtered through the canvas walls, suggesting dawn had arrived. Beside her, James was already awake, his grey eyes alert as he carefully extricated himself from their communal bedding, without disturbing the still sleeping twins. "Storms past," he confirmed, peering through a small opening in the shelter's entrance, "but it's left its mark." When Sarah joined him at the opening, she understood his concern. The narrow trail they had been following was now invisible, completely buried beneath several feet of fresh snow. Worse, the new snowfall appeared unstable, clinging to the steep slope in precarious layers that could easily give way under their weight. "Can we continue?" she asked, dreading the answer. James surveyed the transformed landscape with a tracker's assessing eye. "Not along our planned route," he replied. "Too dangerous. Avalanche conditions." For a moment, Sarah's heart sank. If they couldn't go forward, and returning meant facing the Mitchell men, what options remained? But James was already studying the ridge with renewed focus. "There's another way," he said finally. "More difficult, less direct, but safer under these conditions." He pointed to a series of rock outcroppings that created a jagged line down the mountain's opposite face. "We descend there, then circle back to Serpent Creek Valley from the western approach." The route he indicated looked impossibly steep and treacherous to Sarah's untrained eye. "Can the children manage that descent?" "They'll ride in the sled, secured with extra ropes," James explained, already mentally calculating the adjustments needed. "I'll go first, controlling the descent with ropes from below. You'll guide from above." He met her eyes directly. "It requires absolute focus and precision from both of us." The implicit question in his expression was clear. Did she trust him enough for this? Was she capable of performing her critical role in this dangerous maneuver? "I can do it," Sarah stated, with more confidence than she felt. "Just show me exactly what's needed." The next hour was consumed with careful preparations. James reinforced the sled's runners with strips of metal from his supplies, creating better control surfaces for the descent. He fashioned harnesses from rope for both himself and Sarah, designed to anchor them securely during the operation. Most importantly, he created an elaborate system of safety lines for the twins, ensuring that even if the sled slipped, they would remain secured to the anchoring ropes. Throughout these preparations, he explained each step with calm precision, testing Sarah's understanding and having her practice critical knots and rope handling techniques until he was satisfied with her proficiency. The twins, now awake and fed a quick breakfast of pemmican and dried fruit, watched these preparations with solemn interest. James took time to explain the plan to them as well, emphasizing the importance of remaining absolutely still within the sled during the descent. Like stone statues, Hannah affirmed, clearly taking her role seriously. Exactly, James nodded. Approvingly. No matter what you see or hear, remain still until I give the signal that it's safe to move. By mid-morning, they were ready. James deconstructed their shelter, repacking the canvas and securing their supplies. Before beginning the descent, he took a moment to scan the surrounding peaks and valleys, searching for any sign of pursuit or danger. Clear for now, he reported, but we should expect the Mitchell men to realize their mistake soon. They'll have scouts checking alternate routes. Sarah nodded, accepting this assessment. Part of her had hoped the storm might have deterred Frederick's men entirely, but she knew her father-in-law's stubborn determination too well. Weather would delay, not defeat, his pursuit. The descent began with heart-stopping steepness. James moved first, establishing anchor points with his ice axe and setting up a belay system that would control the sled's downward progress. Each step required careful testing of the snow's stability. Each anchor point demanded perfect placement. From her position above, Sarah could see the full extent of their predicament, a nearly vertical descent of about 200 feet, with treacherous snow conditions and minimal solid footing. One mistake, one slipped knot, or poorly placed anchor could send them all plummeting down the mountainside. Yet, as they progressed, foot by painstaking foot, her initial terror gave way to focused concentration. James's methodical approach, his absolute confidence in each movement, steadied her. The system he had designed worked precisely as intended, allowing them to lower the sled containing the twins in controlled increments between secure positions. Halfway down, disaster nearly struck when a seemingly solid outcropping crumbled under James's weight, sending him sliding several feet before his safety line caught. Sarah's heart lurched, but James recovered instantly, finding new footing and signaling for her to continue the operation without pause. The descent took nearly 3 hours. 3 hours of intense concentration, burning muscles, and constant vigilance against the mountain's treachery. When they finally reached the relative safety of the tree line below, all four were exhausted, their hands raw despite thick gloves, their bodies drained by the sustained tension. But they had made it. Against formidable odds, they had navigated. A passage that most experienced mountaineers would have deemed impossible, especially with young children. "You did well," James told Sarah as they paused to rest and reorient themselves in the shelter of mature pines. It was the highest praise he could offer, delivered with genuine respect rather than condescension. "We all did," Sarah replied, including the twins in her glance. Indeed, the girls had maintained perfect stillness throughout the terrifying descent, following James's instructions with a discipline that belied their young age. As James consulted his compass and prepared to lead them toward the western approach to Serpent Creek Valley, Sarah realized something fundamental had shifted within her. The woman who had left Thornfield Manor, wounded by rejection, uncertain of her capacity to protect her children, was gone. In her place stood someone stronger, more capable, and infinitely more determined. The mountain had tested them all and found them worthy. Whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them with the same resilience that had brought them down that impossible slope. one careful step at a time, each supporting the others, surrendering neither to fear nor to despair. The western approach to Serpent Creek Valley unfolded before them like a painting, sunlight filtering through towering pines, casting dappled shadows across pristine snow, the distant ribbon of the creek itself visible only as a darker line winding through white blanketed terrain. Their progress was slow but steady, the path less treacherous than the mountain crossing, but challenging in different ways. Dense forest required constant navigation adjustments. Fallen trees created obstacles that needed clearing or circumventing, and wildlife trails sometimes ended abruptly, forcing them to forge their own route. By mid-afternoon, the twins' initial excitement had given way to fatigue. Even James, with his seemingly inexhaustible stamina, showed signs of strain, the previous day's ordeal and minimal rest taking their toll on his normally fluid movements. "We'll rest at the next suitable clearing," he announced, scanning the terrain ahead. "Need to assess our position and plan our night camp." That suitable clearing appeared about 20 minutes later. A small meadow sheltered by a semicircle of evergreens with a rocky outcropping that would provide protection from the prevailing wind. As they entered the open space, however, James suddenly halted, raising one hand in a signal to stop. Sarah froze, instantly alert to potential danger. The twins, sensing the change in atmosphere, fell silent in their sled. James gestured toward the far side of the clearing, where Sarah now noticed subtle disturbances in the snow's surface, indentations that might have been footprints, partially, filled by recent snowfall. "Someone's been here," he murmured, moving forward cautiously to examine the tracks. "Within the last day." "Mitchell men," Sarah whispered, her hand instinctively moving toward the revolver in her coat pocket. James crouched to study the impressions more closely. "No," he replied after a moment. "Wrong pattern for multiple men with sleds. This is—" He hesitated, following the trail with his eyes. A single traveler on snowshoes, moving east to west, carrying weight. He stood, scanning the tree line, with heightened vigilance. Could be a trapper, could be a prospector. Either way, we're not alone in this valley. The knowledge that another person traversed this seemingly empty wilderness created a complex mix of emotions for Sarah. On one hand, any stranger represented potential danger, if not directly, then as a possible source of information for the Mitchell men if they came searching. On the other hand, after days of isolation, the reminder that the broader world still existed carried a strange comfort. "Shall we find another place to rest?" she asked, deferring to James's wilderness judgment. He shook his head slightly. "This location is defensible, provides good visibility. Better to know what's around us than to blunder into surprise later." His eyes narrowed as he surveyed the meadow again. "Besides, these tracks lead away from here. Whoever made them has moved on." They established their temporary camp with greater caution than usual, positioning themselves where they could observe all approaches while remaining partially concealed by the rocks and trees. James kept his rifle within easy reach as he built a small, nearly smokeless fire, using techniques he'd learned from his Blackfoot relatives. The twins, released from the confines of the sled, stretched their legs by helping gather small pieces of kindling under Sarah's watchful eye. Their natural exuberance had returned after a small meal and rest, their capacity for wonder undiminished by the journey's hardships. "Look, Mama!" Hannah called, pointing toward a patch of exposed ground near the rock outcropping. "Flowers in the snow!" Sarah joined her daughter, surprised to discover delicate purple blooms pushing through the white blanket, where the rock's residual warmth had melted a small area. "Snow iris," James identified, glancing over from where he was securing their supplies. "First flower after winter, Blackfoot call it promise bringer, because it promises spring will come." Eliza asked, carefully touching a velvet petal. James nodded. "My mother said they remind us that even the longest winter eventually ends." The simple observation contained layers of meaning that resonated deeply with Sarah. Their own winter, the cold rejection by the Mitchell family, the desperate flight through hostile territory was not yet over, but perhaps these tiny flowers offered a symbolic promise that better days awaited. As twilight approached, James departed briefly to set simple snares in the surrounding forest. Hoping to supplement their dwindling food supplies with fresh meat, Sarah used this time to tend to the twins, checking for any signs of frostbite or exhaustion, and to organize their remaining provisions. The inventory was concerning. Despite James's careful rationing, their food stores had diminished faster than anticipated, partly due to the increased energy demands of traveling in harsh conditions, partly due to the detour forced by the storm. They had perhaps 2 days of adequate nutrition remaining, with Fort Harrison still a substantial journey away. When James returned, she shared this assessment frankly. He received the information without visible concern, simply nodding and making mental adjustments to his calculations. "Game is plentiful in this valley," he noted, "and there are winter plants I can harvest if needed. We won't go hungry." His confidence was not bravado, Sarah knew, but the earned certainty of a man who had lived off this land for years. Still, the precariousness of their situation, 4 people traversing wilderness in winter with minimal supplies, pursued by determined enemies, occasionally struck her with fresh force. As darkness settled fully around their small camp, bringing with it a bone-deep cold that even their fire struggled to dispel, Sarah found herself contemplating the strange twists of fate that had led them here. Had anyone told her a year ago that she would be sitting beside a campfire in Montana wilderness, dressed in Blackfoot clothing, accompanied by a mixed-blood scout, and fleeing her powerful father-in-law, she would have dismissed the scenario as outlandish fiction. Yet here she was, and stranger still, there was a rightness to it that defied rational explanation. Despite the danger, despite the discomfort, despite the uncertainty of what awaited them at journey's end, she felt more genuinely herself than she had in years. At Thornfield Manor, she had been William's unsuitable wife, tolerated for his sake, constantly reminded of her supposed inadequacies, forced to conform to expectations that had felt like shackles. Here, in this primal landscape where pretense served no purpose and survival demanded authenticity, she had rediscovered the capable, determined woman she had been before marriage into the Mitchell dynasty. Her reflection was interrupted by a sound at the edge of the clearing, a distinct crunch of snow under weight, too deliberate for wildlife. In an instant, James was on his feet, rifle ready but not yet raised, his posture alert but controlled. "Who's there?" he called, his voice carrying authority without aggression. "Step forward slowly where we can see you." For several heartbeats, nothing moved. Then from between 2 towering pines, a figure emerged, tall and broad-shouldered, wearing a heavy fur coat and carrying a pack nearly as large as himself. As the stranger moved into the firelight, Sarah could see he was an older man, perhaps 60, with a full white beard and weathered features that spoke of decades in the wilderness. "Evening," the newcomer greeted, his voice surprisingly gentle for his imposing size. He kept his hands visible, making no threatening movements. "Didn't expect company in this valley this time of year." James maintained his vigilant stance, though the rifle remained pointed downward. "Your tracks crossed our path earlier. We thought you'd moved on." "Circled back when I saw your fire," the old man explained. "Been 3 weeks since I've spoken to another soul. Gets lonesome." His kind eyes shifted to the twins, who watched the exchange with undisguised fascination. "Evening, little ladies. Name's Thomas Caldwell. Most folks call me Old Tom." Sarah stiffened at the surname, the same as one of the Mitchell men who had come to James's cabin. The old man noticed her reaction. his bushy eyebrows rising slightly. "No relation to any Caldwell you might be running from," he said perceptively. "There's mean Caldwells, and there's decent ones. I fall in the latter category, or try to." The astute observation that they were indeed running from someone put them all on higher alert. James's stance subtly shifted, placing himself more directly between the stranger and the rest of their group. "What brings you to Serpent Creek, Mr. Caldwell?" Sarah asked, finding her voice. The old man chuckled softly. "Same thing that's brought me to these mountains every winter for 40 years. Trapping, prospecting, and avoiding civilized company." He gestured to his pack. "Got beaver pelts and a modest pouch of color from the creek. Heading to Fort Harrison to trade before spring melt makes the lower trails impassable." The mention of their own destination caused another exchange of glances between Sarah and James. Old Tom caught this silent communication with surprising acuity. "Seems we might be bound for the same place," he observed mildly. "Journeys safer with companions, especially with young'uns along." He slowly lowered his pack to the snow. "I've got fresh venison and coffee. Happy to share if you'll allow me to warm by your fire." James looked to Sarah, leaving the decision to her, a gesture of respect that didn't go unnoticed by the old trapper, whose eyes registered thoughtful approval. Sarah considered the situation carefully. Their food shortage made the offer of fresh meat tremendously appealing, yet the danger of trusting a stranger could not be dismissed, especially given their vulnerable position. "How do we know you're not associated with Frederick Mitchell?" she asked directly, deciding that pretense would serve no purpose. Something like recognition flickered in old Tom's eyes. "Ah," he said, understanding dawning, "you'd be the widow and the little Mitchell girls. Talk in Helena when I passed through. Last month was that you'd left Thornfield rather suddenly." He stroked his beard thoughtfully. "Frederick Mitchell and I have history, none of it friendly. Man tried to claim my trap lines were on his property 15 years back, sent armed men to run me off." "What happened?" James asked, still assessing. "The old man's credibility." A mischievous smile crinkled old Tom's weathered face. "Let's just say his men returned to Thornfield with fewer horses, weapons, and dignity than they arrived with." The smile faded, replaced by more serious consideration. "Frederick Mitchell believes money entitles him to whatever he wants. Land, loyalty, people. I've spent my life proving otherwise." The statement aligned so perfectly with their own situation that Sarah felt a reflexive trust begin to form. Still, caution prevailed. "You said you're heading to Fort Harrison to trade," she noted. "Would your business there be affected if you were to help a woman and children that Frederick Mitchell is pursuing?" Old Tom considered this frankly. "Fort commander is Colonel Blackwood. Known him 20 years. He has no love for Mitchell money or Mitchell methods." The old trapper's gaze was direct and unflinching. "I'm 73 years old, ma'am. Got no family, no land claims, nothing Frederick Mitchell can threaten or take. My conscience is the only boss I answer to these days." Throughout this exchange, James had been observing the old man with a tracker's attention to detail, noting the genuine quality of his weathered expressions, the absence of nervous gestures that might indicate deception, the comfortable way he carried his wilderness gear, suggesting long experience rather than recent acquisition. "Your snares are Blackfoot style," James observed, gesturing to the distinctive traps visible at the top of old Tom's pack. "Few white trappers use that design. Learned from a Blackfoot friend years back," Tom acknowledged. "More humane, more efficient. Why use inferior methods when better ones exist?" He studied James more carefully. "You've got Blackfoot blood. Yourself, I'm guessing. Eyes give it away. Gray is unusual among the people." The conversation shifted to a different level with this observation. Two men who had navigated the complex borders between cultures, recognizing a shared experience. Something subtle relaxed in James's posture. "Share our fire," he offered finally. "Food is welcome, as is company that understands discretion." Old Tom nodded once, acceptance without excessive gratitude, and moved toward the fire with the careful movements of age. As he settled on a log and began extracting food from his pack, the twins overcame their initial shyness and edged closer, drawn by both curiosity about this strange new addition to their party and the enticing aroma of smoked venison. "You girls like stories?" the old trapper asked as he sliced the meat with a well-worn knife. "Got 40 years' worth of mountain tales stored up." "Are they true stories or made-up ones?" Hannah inquired seriously. Old Tom's eyes twinkled. "Bit of both, I expect. Best stories usually are." As they shared a meal far more satisfying than anything they'd had in days, venison supplemented with dried wild onions and actual coffee, a luxury Sarah had nearly forgotten, Old Tom revealed himself to be a natural storyteller. His tales of mountain life, encounters with wildlife and survival against impossible odds both entertained the twins and subtly instructed them in wilderness knowledge. James remained somewhat reserved, but his vigilance gradually eased as the evening progressed, and the old trapper demonstrated both his harmlessness and his valuable knowledge of the territory ahead. By the time they prepared sleeping arrangements for the night, a tentative alliance had formed, not yet full trust, but a practical cooperation born of shared purpose and mutual advantage. "Mitchell's men are watching the main approaches to Fort Harrison," Old Tom informed them as they finalized plans for the next day's journey. "But I know paths they've never dreamed of, old Indian trails, game tracks that don't appear on any map." "How recently have you seen them?" James asked, the tactical implications immediately clear to him. 3 days back," Tom replied. "Group of 6 men, asking questions in the outlying settlements, showing money around, offering rewards for information about a woman and 2 girls. He glanced at Sarah. "Describing you as a deranged widow who'd kidnapped her children after being denied custody due to unstable behavior." The calculated cruelty of Frederick's strategy struck Sarah like a physical blow. Not content with casting them out, he now sought to destroy her character, to paint her as mentally unfit, ensuring that even if they reached civilization, her word would be questioned, her claims dismissed. "Frederick Mitchell truly fears no judgment in this world or the next," she said bitterly. Old Tom's expression was sympathetic but practical. "Men with money rarely do, ma'am. They believe they can purchase salvation as easily as land." He turned, his attention back to the map James had spread between them. "But money can't buy knowledge of paths like this one. We'll be at Fort Harrison before Mitchell's men even realize which direction you've gone." As they settled for the night, the addition of Old Tom's extra blankets and his massive bearskin coat making their sleeping arrangements considerably more comfortable, Sarah found herself reflecting on the unpredictable nature of their journey. What had seemed a disastrous detour, forced by the storm on Blacktail Ridge, had led to this unexpected alliance with a man uniquely positioned to help them navigate the final leg to safety. Perhaps, she thought as sleep began to claim her, there was a pattern at work beyond random chance, a design not unlike the wilderness itself, where apparent chaos revealed intricate purpose when viewed with sufficient perspective. First James finding them in the abandoned cabin, now Old Tom crossing their path precisely when they needed additional resources and route knowledge. Coincidence, providence, or simply the natural confluence of lives moving through the same harsh territory with similar purpose. Whatever force had brought them together, Sarah felt a growing certainty that they would reach Fort Harrison and the safety it promised. Frederick Mitchell's money and influence were formidable weapons, but they were countered now by something equally powerful: the accumulated wisdom and survival skills of those who had made the wilderness their home and their teacher. The final day's journey to Fort Harrison began before dawn, with old Tom leading them along hidden paths that wound through terrain so rugged, Sarah wondered how anyone had discovered such routes in the first place. Elk made these trails, the old trapper explained when she voiced this question. Indians followed the elk. Trappers like me followed the Indians. Nature designed better roads than any engineer could dream up. Their progress was remarkably swift. Under Tom's guidance, he knew precisely where treacherous ice might lurk beneath innocent-looking snow, which slopes would support their weight and which might trigger avalanches, where hidden springs created patches of relative warmth, where they could rest briefly without losing body heat. By mid-afternoon, they reached a high ridge from which, for the first time, they could see Fort Harrison in the distance, a collection of sturdy wooden buildings surrounded by a palisade wall, nestled in a protected valley with mountains rising on three sides. "There she is," old Tom announced with satisfaction. "Last outpost of what folks call civilization, though I've my own thoughts on that claim. The sight should have been purely joyful, their destination finally in view after so much struggle." Yet Sarah felt a curious ambivalence as she gazed at the fort, a strange reluctance that took her by surprise. "What happens when we arrive?" she asked quietly, the question directed more to herself than to her companions. James, standing beside her on the ridge, seemed to understand the complexity behind her simple query. "You reclaim your life," he replied, "on your terms, not Frederick Mitchell's." The answer resonated with truth, yet didn't fully address the unspoken concern in her heart. These past weeks had transformed them all. The wilderness, for all its dangers, had also offered a rare freedom from social judgment, from the constraints of proper behavior, from the suffocating expectations that had defined her existence. At Thornfield Manor, would that hard-won liberation survive their return to the structured world of military outposts and frontier towns? Could the strength she had discovered in herself withstand the inevitable pressure to conform once again to society's narrow definition of widowhood and motherhood? "Fort Harrison isn't Thornfield," James added, as if following her thoughts. "Different rules, different possibilities." Old Tom nodded agreement as he joined them at the overlook. "Colonel Blackwood runs things his own way out here. Judges folks by their character, not their circumstances." He gestured toward the distant fort. "And he respects those who've proven themselves against the mountains, which you surely have." The twins, catching the adult's serious mood, pressed closer to Sarah, their small faces upturned with questions they couldn't quite formulate. "Will we have proper beds again?" Hannah wondered practically. "And hot chocolate?" Eliza added, her priorities equally clear. Their innocent concerns brought welcome perspective, dispelling some of Sarah's more abstract anxieties. Whatever uncertainties awaited, they had survived the immediate dangers. Her daughters would sleep in safety tonight with warm food and proper shelter. The rest could be navigated one step at a time, as James had taught her. "Yes to beds, probable yes to hot chocolate," she assured them with a smile. "And no more sleeping in snow caves." "Aye, like the snow caves," Eliza declared loyally, glancing at James. "Mr. James made them special for us." The simple observation highlighted another unspoken question hanging in the air. What role would James Running Wolf play in their lives once they reached Fort Harrison? Would their paths diverge, his wilderness skills no longer essential for their survival? The thought created an unexpected hollow feeling in Sarah's chest. Before she could dwell on this, old Tom interrupted her thoughts. "We should move on," he advised, nodding toward gathering clouds on the western horizon. "Storm brewing. Best reach the fort before it hits." The descent from the ridge proceeded without incident, though the terrain remained challenging. As they drew nearer to the fort, they encountered more evidence of human presence: blazed trees marking boundaries, the occasional trapper's cabin set back from the main trail, and finally, wagon tracks in the snow indicating regular traffic between the fort and outlying settlements. About a mile from Fort Harrison's gates, old Tom suddenly raised his hand, signaling them to halt. "Riders coming," he warned, his experienced ear catching sounds Sarah couldn't yet detect. James immediately guided them into the shelter of dense pines beside the trail, where they waited with tense vigilance as the hoofbeats grew louder. Shortly, 3 mounted men appeared around a bend, riding at a steady pace toward the fort. Even without the Mitchell Ranch insignia visible on their saddlebags, Sarah would have recognized Joseph Caldwell's stocky figure and florid face. "Mitchell, men!" she whispered unnecessarily, drawing the twins closer. They remained motionless as the riders passed, concealed by the trees and the fading afternoon light. Once the danger had passed, old Tom assessed their situation with pragmatic clarity. "They're likely reporting to their companions stationed near the fort," he reasoned, "which means we need an approach that bypasses the main gates." "Service entrance," James suggested immediately. "North side, used for supply deliveries. Less visible, minimal guards." Old Tom nodded approvingly. "My thoughts exactly. And I know the sergeant who usually oversees that gate. Man owes me for some venison that found its way to his table when supplies ran short last winter." This new complication demanded further adjustment to their plans. Instead of the direct approach they had anticipated, they were forced to circle wide around the fort's perimeter, using the lengthening shadows and old Tom's intimate knowledge of the terrain to avoid detection. The storm clouds continued gathering, bringing premature darkness and a sharp drop in temperature. By the time they reached the fort's northern edge, fat snowflakes had begun falling, rapidly increasing in intensity, nature's final challenge before they reached safety. The service entrance proved to be a narrow gate set into the palisade wall, with a small guardhouse beside it. As they approached, a soldier emerged, rifle at the ready. "Halt and identify yourselves," he called into the swirling snow. "It's old Tom Caldwell," the trapper replied, stepping forward where he could be clearly seen, "bringing pelts and some travelers seeking the colonel's protection." The guard squinted through the thickening snowfall, then his weathered face broke into a grin of recognition. "Tom, you old mountain goat. Thought you'd be holed up in some cave until spring thaw." "Winter's no match for this old carcass," Tom returned good-naturedly. "Now, about these travelers, matters urgent, Jackson. Mitchell men at the main gate would do them harm." The soldier's expression shifted to one of wary understanding. He stepped closer, eyeing Sarah and the twins, then James's protective stance beside them. "Mitchell, you say? Frederick Mitchell?" Sarah stepped forward, drawing herself up with dignity despite her travel-worn appearance. "I am Sarah Mitchell, widow of William Mitchell. These are our daughters. Frederick Mitchell has men searching for us with the intention of forcing us back to Thornfield Manor against our will." Sergeant Jackson absorbed this information with the measured consideration of a man accustomed to frontier complications. "Colonel Blackwood mentioned something about Mitchell men making inquiries," he admitted. "Didn't care for their manner or their story." His gaze shifted to James. "And you are?" "James Running Wolf," he replied simply. "Former Army scout. I've guided Mrs. Mitchell and her children here from my cabin near Blacktail Ridge." The name appeared to register with the sergeant. "Worked with Lieutenant Harrison some years back?" James nodded once. "That's good enough for me," Jackson decided. "The lieutenant speaks highly of you." He stepped back, opening the gate just wide enough for them to pass through. "I'll take you directly to Colonel Blackwood. Stay close and keep those children covered. We'll avoid the main yard where Mitchell's men might spot you." As they followed the sergeant through the fort's back areas, Sarah was struck by how completely their circumstances had changed in mere moments. After weeks in wilderness where danger could approach from any direction, they were now within walls, surrounded by armed soldiers, ostensibly safe, yet still moving furtively, still hiding. Colonel Blackwood's quarters occupied a solid 2-story. building near the center of the fort. Inside, they found a spare but comfortable office, warmed by a substantial fireplace, maps covering the walls, and a desk piled with reports and correspondence. The colonel himself proved to be a tall, lean man in his 50s, with iron-grey hair cropped close to his skull and penetrating blue eyes that missed nothing. He received their party with composed interest, listening without interruption as old Tom briefly explained their situation. "Mrs. Mitchell," he acknowledged when the trapper finished, bowing slightly in her direction. "Your father-in-law's representatives have indeed been making inquiries. Their version of events differs significantly from what I'm hearing now." "I imagine it does," Sarah replied steadily. "Frederick Mitchell is not a man who allows truth to interfere with his objectives." A hint of appreciation showed in the colonel's expression at her directness. "So I've gathered from previous dealings with him." He gestured toward chairs arranged near the fire. "Please, sit. You look exhausted, and these children deserve warmth and rest." As they settled by the hearth, the colonel summoned his orderly and issued quiet instructions. Within minutes, hot food arrived. A simple but nourishing stew, fresh bread, and, to the twins' delight, steaming mugs of hot chocolate. While they ate their first proper meal in weeks, Colonel Blackwood drew James and old Tom aside for a more detailed account of their journey. Sarah could see the military man's respect growing as they described the challenges they had overcome, particularly the treacherous crossing of Blacktail Ridge during the storm. When they had finished both their meal and their narrative, the colonel addressed Sarah directly. "Mrs. Mitchell, this fort stands on federal land, outside the jurisdiction of territorial authorities who might be influenced by your father-in-law's connections. You and your daughters will remain under military protection while we sort out this situation properly." Relief washed through Sarah at this simple declaration. For the first time since William's death, someone with genuine authority had acknowledged her rights and her children's welfare above Frederick Mitchell's demands. "As for you, Running Wolf," the colonel continued, turning to James, "I find myself in need of a scout familiar with the Northern Territories. Lieutenant Harrison speaks highly of your tracking abilities, and this journey confirms his assessment. There would be a place for you here, should you want it." James's expression remained characteristically impassive, though Sarah detected a subtle shift in his posture. Surprise, perhaps, at being offered a position of respect rather than mere utility. "I'll consider it," he replied non-committally. As the evening progressed, arrangements were made for their accommodations. The twins, overcome by the warmth and security after so long in the wilderness, fell asleep on a makeshift pallet near the fire, while the adults continued their discussions. Sarah learned that her cousin Martha was indeed still in Sweetwater Creek, her husband now serving as the settlement's doctor. Colonel Blackwood offered to send a military escort to bring them to Fort Harrison once the current storm passed, a reunion Sarah had begun to believe might never happen. Later, as she tucked the twins into real beds in the quarters assigned to them, Hannah asked the question that had been forming in her young mind. "Mama, will Mr. James stay with us now that we're safe?" The innocent query crystallized Sarah's own unspoken concerns about their future. In the wilderness, necessity had forged bonds between them that transcended conventional relationships. What would those bonds become in this new context? "I don't know, sweetheart," she answered honestly. "Mr. James has his own life, his own choices to make." After the twins had fallen asleep, Sarah found herself drawn to the window, watching the snow continue to fall, transforming the fort into a scene of ethereal beauty. A soft knock at the door revealed James, still in his travel-worn buckskins, but with his hair freshly washed and tied back. "Colonel wants to speak with us again in the morning," he informed her. "Mitchell's men have requested a formal meeting. He won't allow it without our presence and consent." Sarah nodded, appreciating Blackwood's respect for their agency in the matter. "Will you accept his offer?" she asked, the question emerging before she could reconsider it. "To stay on as a scout?" James was silent for a long moment, his grey eyes thoughtful. "Depends," he said finally. "On what?" "On whether there's reason to stay." His gaze held hers with uncharacteristic directness. "The mountains have been my home because I belonged nowhere else. That might have changed." The simple statement contained layers of meaning that Sarah understood implicitly. During their journey, something fundamental had shifted between them. Mutual respect evolving into deeper regard. Shared hardship revealing compatible values and complementary strengths. "The twins would miss you terribly if you left," she offered carefully. Only the twins. A rare hint of vulnerability showed in his expression. Sarah took a deep breath, acknowledging the truth that had been forming in her heart since those first days in his cabin. "No," she admitted quietly. "Not only the twins." Whatever response James might have made was interrupted by a commotion in the fort's main yard. Raised voices, the distinctive sound of horses arriving at speed. They moved to the window together, watching as a group of riders dismounted near the command building, their fine horses and expensive cold-weather gear marking them as men of means rather than typical frontier travelers. "Frederick," Sarah breathed, recognizing her father-in-law's commanding figure even at a distance, even through the falling snow. "He's come himself." James's expression hardened. "He's made a miscalculation. Here, he has no authority, no influence to wield." As if confirming this assessment, they watched Colonel Blackwood emerge to meet the new arrivals, his posture and gestures clearly establishing boundaries. Though they couldn't hear the exchange, its nature was evident. Frederick Mitchell was being denied immediate access to the fort's interior, required to state his business officially before proceeding further. "The Colonel is a man of principle," James observed with quiet satisfaction. Rare quality these days. The confrontation in the yard continued briefly before the Mitchell party was escorted to guest quarters separate from the main buildings, effectively confined while maintaining the minimum courtesies due their social position. "Tomorrow will bring resolution, one way or another," James said, turning back to Sarah. "Whatever happens, remember what you learned in the mountains. Your strength, your capacity to protect your children, your ability to adapt and overcome, those belong to you, not circumstances." The wisdom in his words steadied her, replacing anxiety with renewed determination. Frederick Mitchell might have wealth and social connections, but she had discovered resources within herself that his money couldn't buy or break. "We should rest," Sarah suggested, suddenly aware of the bone-deep exhaustion they all shared after their long journey. "Tomorrow will require clear minds." James nodded, but lingered a moment longer. "The twins asked me something earlier," he said, an unusual hesitation in his voice. "Whether I would teach them more Blackfoot words and stories now that we're safe." "What did you tell them?" Sarah asked, hearing the deeper question beneath his statement. "That some stories take a lifetime to tell properly." His eyes met hers with quiet intensity. "If they wanted to hear them all, we would need time, a great deal of time." The implicit promise in his words, of continued presence, of shared future, created a warm certainty in Sarah's heart that contrasted sharply with the raging storm outside. "They would like that very much," she replied softly. "So would I." As James departed to his own quarters, Sarah returned to the window, watching the snow transform Fort Harrison into a pristine landscape where tomorrow's paths remained to be chosen. Frederick Mitchell waited beyond those walls, determined to reassert control over what he viewed as Mitchell property, her daughters, heirs to the Mitchell name and fortune. But arrayed against him stood unexpected allies. James Running Wolf, with his quiet strength and wilderness wisdom, Old Tom Caldwell, with his decades of frontier knowledge, Colonel Blackwood, with his principled leadership and military authority, and most importantly, Sarah herself, no longer the intimidated widow who had fled Thornfield Manor in desperate haste, but a woman who had crossed mountains, faced blizzards, and discovered her own unyielding core in the process. Tomorrow would indeed bring resolution, but not the one Frederick Mitchell anticipated. The battle for her children's future would be fought on different terms than the old patriarch understood, not with money or social position as weapons, but with the truth of what truly constituted family, belonging, and home. As one journey ended, another began, one that would eventually lead Sarah, Hannah, and Eliza not back to Thornfield's oppressive grandeur, but forward into a life where they defined their own worth, chose their own path, and created family bonds based on love and respect rather than obligation and control. And beside them on that path would walk James Running Wolf, the silent warrior who had already made them his own in all the ways that truly mattered, not through possession or authority, but through protection freely given, wisdom generously shared, and a heart open to possibilities he had long ago ceased to imagine for himself. In the harsh Montana winter of 1899, four souls cast out by circumstance had found in each other what the comfortable world had failed to provide: acceptance without conditions, strength in vulnerability, and the profound recognition that family is not always determined by blood, but by those who stand beside you when the storms come, guiding you safely home. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.